Something is happening right now that the entire world is watching in complete silence. A stretch of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point is holding the global economy hostage. Oil prices are shattering records. Tankers sit anchored and motionless in the Persian Gulf. 230 loaded oil ships are trapped inside, going nowhere. And at the center of it all, two nuclear-armed postures stare at each other across the most important waterway on Earth. But here is what most people do not realize. This is no longer just a military standoff. What the United States has done to the Strait of Hormuz is something that has never been attempted in this region at this scale. And Iran, the country that spent decades threatening to close this very strait, has now found itself in a position it never expected to be in. Powerless. Not because its military was defeated entirely, not because it surrendered, but because of a move so economically calculated, so surgically brutal, that it has turned Iran's greatest weapon against itself. The question is not who wins this standoff. The question is how long Iran can survive it. And the answer to that question is running out faster than anyone in Tehran ever imagined. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to one night that changed everything. February 28th, 2026. Late in the evening, explosions tore through the skies above Tehran. The United States and Israel had launched a joint military operation against Iran. It was not a warning. It was not a limited strike. The opening hours targeted military infrastructure, command centers, and government sites. Among those killed in the initial strikes was Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei himself, along with several senior officials who had gathered based on intelligence Iran never knew had been compromised. In a matter of hours, the Islamic Republic of Iran lost the man who had led it for over 3 decades. But Iran was not done, not even close. Within hours of those first explosions, Iran did exactly what it had threatened to do for years. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps vessels moved into position. Sea mines were laid across the shipping lanes. Small fast attack boats swarmed the narrow corridor. Drone squadrons and missile batteries along Iran's mountainous coastline were activated. Iranian warnings went out to every commercial vessel in the area. Transit through the strait at your own risk. And just like that, 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas supply stopped moving. Shipping companies did not need to be told twice. They turned their tankers around. War risk insurance premiums for any vessel attempting the strait skyrocketed to levels that made the transit economically impossible. By early March, only 15 ships had made it through in the entire first 10 days of the crisis. The strait was not technically closed. It was simply too dangerous, too expensive, and too uncertain for the world's commercial shipping industry to use. Oil prices exploded. Dubai crude reached $166 per barrel, the highest on record. In California alone, gasoline crossed $5 a gallon. Stock markets trembled. Economies that depended on Gulf energy supplies began emergency calculations. This is the moment when many thought Iran had won. But they were watching the wrong move. Because while the world focused on the Iranian mines and the shuttered shipping lanes, the United States was preparing something far more patient, far more devastating, and far more difficult to escape. Throughout March, American forces were not sitting still. The U.S. Navy began the largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, already deployed on what would become a record-breaking 296-day deployment, was redirected toward the region. The USS Abraham Lincoln arrived with its full strike group. Destroyers, cruisers, F-35C fighters, Super Hornets, Growlers. The U.S. had positioned more naval firepower in and around the Persian Gulf than at almost any point in modern history. But the key weapon was not a missile or a fighter jet. It was a clock. Iran's economy, already shattered by years of sanctions, was surviving on one lifeline: oil exports. That oil moved through one exit point. And that exit point was the Strait of Hormuz, the very waterway Iran had now effectively closed to the world. Think about what that means. Iran had used the threat of closing the strait for decades as leverage. The assumption was always that Iran could close the strait to everyone else while still managing to extract its own economic value from the situation. But in blocking the strait, Iran had also blocked its own revenue. Every day the strait remained shut, Iran bled money, and not a small amount. By the time the United States finished calculating the damage, Iranian oil exports had fallen to near zero. The U.S. Treasury Secretary made the situation plain. Iranian oil storage at Karg Island, the country's main export terminal, was filling up with nowhere to send its inventory. Iran's fragile oil wells, the kind that required continuous operation to maintain pressure, were at risk of long-term damage if production had to be shut in. The clock was ticking not just on Iran's revenue, but on the physical infrastructure of its energy sector. Iran had detonated a bomb, and it was standing inside the blast radius. But the United States was not done. On April 13, 2026, after the collapse of peace talks in Islamabad, the U.S. military announced a naval blockade. not of the Strait of Hormuz itself, not of international waters. Something more precise, more defensible, and more suffocating. A blockade of all ships entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas. The U.S. Central Command was explicit. The blockade would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels going to and from non-Iranian destinations. Normal international shipping could continue. The blockade was targeted at one country, at one coastline, at one government, Iran. Within the first 24 hours, over 10,000 American personnel supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft were enforcing the operation. 6 commercial ships complied with orders and turned back. No vessels attempted to breach the line. Trump called it publicly what it was designed to be: economic strangulation. He claimed, and officials did not dispute the number, that the blockade was costing Iran $500 million every single day. $500 million every day. This is where the trap became visible to the entire world. Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon against the United States and the global oil market. The United States responded not by trying to force the strait open immediately, which would have required a dangerous and costly military operation through Iranian mines and missile batteries. Instead, Washington turned the Iranian blockade around and pointed it directly at Tehran. Iran was blockading the world. America was blockading Iran. And in that exchange, Iran was the only country slowly running out of money, running out of oil storage, running out of time. The situation in Islamabad should have been a turning point. For the first time since 2015, American and Iranian officials sat in the same room face to face. Vice President Vance led the American delegation alongside Special Envoy Witkoff. Iran sent its Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf. The talks lasted 21 hours. They produced nothing. Vance emerged from Islamabad and delivered the American position without softening it. Iran needed to make an affirmative commitment that it would not seek a nuclear weapon and would not seek the tools to achieve one quickly. That was the bottom line. That was the requirement, and Iran would not give it. The talks collapsed. The blockade began days later. What happened next showed the world how desperate the situation had become inside Iran. Iran began allowing some ships to pass through the strait, not as a gesture of peace, not as a diplomatic opening, but in exchange for a toll up to $2 million per ship. Iran was selling passage through a waterway it claimed sovereign control over, selecting which countries could pass and which could not. Russia and China were favored. American allies were not. Iran's foreign minister made the hierarchy explicit, saying the strait was open to all nations except the United States, Israel, and their allies. It was a move that generated revenue, but it also confirmed something that the world had been suspecting. Iran had lost track of some of the mines it had laid in the strait. According to reports that emerged in mid-April, Tehran was physically unable to fully reopen the waterway, even if it wanted to. The weapon it had used against the world was now partially beyond its own control. The mines were out there. No one knew exactly where all of them were. No commercial shipping company was willing to send a billion-dollar tanker through waters that might have invisible explosives drifting through the shipping lanes. Iran had built a trap, and it could not turn it off. By late April, the situation had escalated into what observers began describing as a dual blockade. Iran was blocking the Gulf. America was blocking Iran. Neither side was moving. And between them, 230 loaded oil tankers sat motionless in the Persian Gulf, waiting. The U.S. Navy began mine-clearing operations. Destroyers entered the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began, described by American officials as a freedom of navigation operation. Iran threatened to attack the ships and accused Washington of violating the ceasefire. But the mine-clearing continued. Trump announced an extended ceasefire to allow more time for negotiations. But the blockade stayed in place. Iran attacked 3 commercial ships in the strait just hours after that announcement. Iran's chief negotiator said the ceasefire was meaningless while the blockade continued. Iran's president posted a statement saying that blockades and threats were the main obstacles to negotiations. But the math was not changing. Every day without a deal was another day Iran lost hundreds of millions in revenue. Every day without a deal was another day Karg Island's storage filled closer to capacity. Every day without a deal was another day the pressure inside Tehran grew harder to contain. Reports emerged that Iran's military and police forces were complaining about not being paid. The financial system was grinding. Trump posted the number publicly, almost tauntingly. Iran is losing $500 million a day, starving for cash. The U.S. Treasury Secretary warned that once Karg Island storage filled completely, Iran would have to shut in its oil wells. And shutting in those wells is not like turning off a tap. It causes long-term, potentially irreversible damage to the infrastructure that Iran depends on for its most vital export. The clock was no longer just ticking on the ceasefire. It was ticking on Iran's ability to remain a functioning oil-exporting nation at all. Here is what makes this moment so significant. The Strait of Hormuz has been Iran's ultimate threat for generations. Iranian commanders, Iranian politicians, Iranian supreme leaders across decades have invoked the Strait as the weapon that could never be challenged. Close it, and the world economy collapses. The West comes to the table. Oil prices explode, panic spreads. And for years, that threat worked, because no one called it. But what 2026 revealed is that the threat only worked as a threat. The moment Iran actually used it, it exposed the fundamental flaw in the strategy. Iran cannot survive without the Strait being open any more than the world can. The difference is that the world has backup plans, strategic reserves, alternative routes, painful but manageable adjustments. Iran has one port, one export terminal, one primary revenue stream. And it all goes through the same 20-mile gap that Iran mined and blockaded. The United States did not win this confrontation by going through the Strait. It won by going around it, by turning Iran's weapon against Iran, by surrounding the pressure point and watching the consequences compound. At the same time, the U.S. was developing new military targeting plans, options to strike Iran's naval capabilities in the Strait more directly if the ceasefire collapsed entirely. Fast attack boats, mine-laying vessels, asymmetric assets that had been the backbone of Iran's maritime strategy. The planning was specific, focused, and ready to execute. Iran was not just economically squeezed, it was militarily surrounded, its allies weakened, its supreme leader gone, its proxy networks fraying, its negotiating position shrinking by the day. The world has been watching this unfold and asking a question that does not have a comfortable answer. What does Iran do now? Iran cannot fully reopen the Strait because it lost track of its own mines. It cannot resume full oil exports because of the American blockade. It cannot resume military operations without triggering a resumed air campaign against the remains of its military infrastructure. Its nuclear program, the long-term deterrent it spent decades building, is now the central demand in negotiations that Iran desperately needs to succeed, but cannot afford to concede. The Iranian parliament is reportedly planning legislation to permanently restrict certain nations from the Strait. Iranian officials are warning of military responses to blockade enforcement, but warnings from a government that cannot pay its own security forces carry a different weight than they did a year ago. Iran offered a proposal in late April to reopen the Strait on the condition that the U.S. lift its naval blockade and end the war. The United States was largely dismissive. Trump's inner circle said he did not like the proposal because it did not include provisions for the nuclear program. The leverage was still with Washington, and so both sides remained stuck. Iran trapped by the consequences of its own weapon. The United States holding a blockade that cost nothing to maintain and everything to Iran. The world's oil market watching crude prices, shipping lanes, and diplomatic statements with the same intensity. The ceasefire extended. The blockade continued. The talks remained uncertain, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf, 230 oil tankers sat in the water and waited for someone to blink. This is not how anyone expected this to end. The Strait of Hormuz was supposed to be Iran's ultimate card, the one move that could bring any adversary to the table on Iranian terms. Decades of military planning, tunnel networks carved into the mountains along the Iranian coastline, hidden speedboats and missile batteries and drone squadrons, all built around the assumption that control of this 20-mile waterway meant leverage over the entire world. And, in a sense, Iran was right. The Strait matters enormously. The crisis proved that beyond any doubt. Oil at $166, reserves being released, trade routes disrupted across the globe. But what Iran miscalculated was this: using the weapon is not the same as winning with it. And what the United States demonstrated is that you do not have to fight through a minefield to defeat the person who laid it. You simply wait and watch. And make sure the person standing in the minefield knows you are comfortable waiting much longer than they can. The question now is not whether Iran can hold on indefinitely. It cannot. The question is what Iran is willing to give up to make this stop. And that answer, whatever it turns out to be, will define not just the future of Iran, but the shape of power in the Middle East for a generation to come. The world is watching. The clock is running. And the Strait of Hormuz, the most important 20 miles of water on the planet, remains the place where that answer will ultimately be written.